I remember the sound first, not the words, not the silence that followed. Just the small, precise sound of silverware touching china, and the way it paused for half a second when Trevor laughed. It was Christmas night in Maple Grove, Ohio. I had been on my feet since before sunrise. The ham was glazed, the sweet potatoes were still warm, and the pecan pie was cooling on the sideboard. Chloe, my granddaughter, had left one of her glittery hair clips under my dining chair. I noticed it when I sat down, though I didn't pick it up right away. At the time, I didn't think much of it. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted sugar. Snow pressed softly against the windows outside, the kind of quiet winter snowfall that makes the world look calm, even when people inside the house aren't. I had spent most of the evening doing what I had done for years, refilling glasses, carrying plates, letting other people speak over me, as if that was simply the natural arrangement of things. Lydia sat across from me, in a green velvet blouse. She had probably chosen more for photographs than for comfort. Trevor occupied the end of the table with the relaxed confidence of someone who had already decided no one in the room would challenge him. Mason was quietly sliding extra dinner rolls into his lap. Chloe was braiding the fringe of the table runner with complete concentration. It should have felt warm. It was Christmas. The tree lights were glowing in the den. Cinnamon candles burned along the hallway shelf. Somewhere in the background, the television murmured softly, because Trevor liked having noise during holiday dinners. Usually, I disliked that. Meals, to me, should sound like conversation, not waiting rooms. But that night, the television turned out to be useful, because I had made one small mistake. I mentioned my course. Not the whole business, just the course. While passing the dinner rolls, I casually mentioned that enrollment on my online quilting platform had picked up after I added a set of advanced stitching workshops. That was all. One sentence. Trevor laughed immediately. Not loudly, just a short, neat laugh that carried enough edge to make its point. "Still trying to get rich online?" he said. He leaned back in his chair when he said it, one arm draped casually across the backrest, as if the remark had been harmless. But the tone wasn't playful. It had that polished sharpness people sometimes use when they want to humiliate someone, while keeping the option of calling it a joke later. Lydia smiled into her wineglass. "Mom," she said, "you've been doing these little projects forever. It's sweet, but it's not exactly a business." Sweet. I've noticed that when adults call a woman in her 50s sweet, they rarely mean kind. They usually mean small. I looked down at my plate and adjusted the napkin on my lap. I didn't answer right away. I had learned long ago that arguing at a dinner table rarely improves anything. It only gives unkind people more room to perform. Trevor wasn't finished. "She can't keep steady work," he said, gesturing toward the hallway where my office sat with the laptop still open on the desk. "Now she thinks quilting videos are the future." Chloe glanced up for a moment, sensing the change in tone without quite understanding it. Lydia gave Trevor a brief look that was meant to appear corrective, but carried the quiet amusement of someone who believes they're both sharing the same joke. I felt the warmth rise in my face. Not dramatic anger. Just that slow pulse under the skin, when you realize people have quietly built a story about your life and have been repeating it without asking whether it was true. I folded my hands in my lap and let the moment sit. Some people mistake silence for permission. The thought came to me clearly then. I didn't say it aloud. I simply recognized it, the way you recognize a sentence that explains something you've been observing for years. Some people mistake silence for permission. They think that if you don't correct them every time, you must agree with the version of you they've invented. From the den, the television volume shifted. One of those bright, polished theme songs local news stations use began playing faintly in the background. I knew what was coming. 2 weeks earlier, a producer from the regional station had interviewed me about building an online education platform after 50. My marketing coordinator had encouraged it. Local features helped reach new students. What I hadn't expected was the timing. The anchor's voice carried from the den. Tonight, a Maple Grove entrepreneur is redefining what a second act can look like. No one moved. Lydia turned first, then Trevor. I stayed where I was. The room went quiet. People say that phrase often, but sometimes it's the only accurate one. The room really did go quiet, as if the house itself had paused to listen. My face appeared on the television. I couldn't see the screen directly from where I sat, only the reflection in the glass cabinet beside the dining table. A softer version of me, blue sweater, hair pinned back, sitting in my office, with the quilts hanging neatly on the wall behind me. The reporter continued. Evelyn Carter, founder of Thread and Grace Academy, has built one of the fastest-growing online textile learning platforms in the Midwest, serving tens of thousands of students across the United States and internationally. Trevor's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Lydia turned so quickly in her chair that her wineglass nearly tipped. "Mom," she said quietly, not warmly, just stunned. The television showed footage from my studio room, the long cutting table by the window, shelves stacked with folded fabric. The camera panned slowly past, framed letters from students before settling on my computer screen, displaying enrollment maps. The reporter mentioned partnerships, expansion, international classes. I didn't remember the exact words. By then I was watching Trevor instead. His expression had changed. Not guilt. Calculation. First shock, then calculation. The look people get when a number enters the room before their apology does. "You're on TV," Mason said. "Yes," I said. I reached for my water glass. My hand was steady. I was glad about that. Trevor cleared his throat. "You never said anything." I turned toward him. What settled over me wasn't anger. It was something cooler than that. Anger rises quickly. This felt more like a drawer sliding quietly shut. "You never asked," I said. No one spoke. The reporter's voice continued describing how the platform began during the pandemic and gradually expanded beyond local workshops. The footage shifted to an event in Columbus where I had spoken earlier that fall. There I was on the screen, shaking hands with a distributor, smiling politely under bright conference lights. Lydia kept looking between the television and me, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. That reaction didn't surprise me. People struggle when the person they've dismissed turns out to have a life they never authorized. Chloe asked the first honest question in the room. "Grandma, are you famous?" I smiled at her. "No, sweetheart," I said. "Just busy." Trevor exhaled slowly, trying to recover his balance. "Well," he said, "this is incredible. Really incredible. Actually incredible." The word actually slipped in there almost by accident. It's surprising how much condescension can fit inside a single adverb. The segment ended. The anchor moved on to the weather forecast. Wind chill advisories. School delays in neighboring counties. Ordinary information. The world returned to normal programming very quickly. No one reached for dessert. I stood and picked up the pie server. "There's pecan and apple," I said calmly. "If anyone still wants some." That was when something inside me shifted, not because of the television, not even because of their embarrassment, but because standing there at the end of my own table, holding pie plates, I understood something clearly for the first time. Lydia and Trevor had constructed a version of me that made them comfortable. A woman slowing down, a woman who needed managing, a woman with small hobbies and harmless ambitions. A woman whose plans were soft enough to laugh at, and for years I had allowed it. Not because it was true, because correcting them every time would have been exhausting. I served dessert calmly. Chloe asked for both pies. Mason wanted extra whipped cream. Lydia barely touched her plate. Trevor kept glancing toward the den, as if the television might somehow undo what it had revealed. I said very little after that. Later, after they left, and the dishes sat stacked in warm water beside the sink, I turned on my laptop and reviewed the business emails that had arrived during dinner. One from my accountant, one from a licensing partner in Minneapolis, one from my operations manager about January enrollment, and one from the news producer thanking me again for the interview. I answered the accountant first. Then I opened a fresh document and began writing notes, dates, comments, patterns I had ignored, questions I had avoided asking. Not emotional notes, procedural ones. At the time, I didn't yet know exactly what I would do with them. But I did know one thing. If something in this family was going to change, it would not happen through arguments at holiday dinners. It would happen through structure. And that night, quietly, I decided that the next step would involve procedure instead of reaction. The first phone call came 3 days after Christmas. I remember the time because I had just finished reviewing the previous week's enrollment reports. The numbers were still climbing in a way that felt slightly unreal to me, even after nearly 2 years of steady growth. There is a difference between hoping something might work and watching it actually take hold. It was 8:37 inches the morning when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. Lydia. At the time, I was standing at the sink, rinsing out my coffee mug. Frost still clung to the edges of the backyard fence, the thin white kind that appears in Ohio when the sun hasn't quite warmed the ground yet. I dried my hands on a dish towel and answered. "Morning, Mum." Her voice carried a brightness that sounded practiced. Not forced exactly, just careful. The kind of tone people use when they are stepping into unfamiliar emotional territory. "Good morning," I said. There was a pause. Not long, but noticeable. "I've been thinking about Christmas," she began. I leaned against the counter and watched a squirrel move carefully along the top rail of the fence outside. At the time, I didn't say anything. Silence, I've found, often encourages people to say what they actually called to say. "We handled that badly," Lydia continued. "Kyle especially feels terrible." I made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement either. "We just didn't realize how serious your business had become," she added. Serious. It was an interesting choice of word. For years, my work had been described as a hobby, a pastime, something charming that filled the hours. Now that a television station had attached words like platform and expansion to it, suddenly the same work carried weight. At the time, I didn't challenge the language. I simply asked, "What can I do for you this morning?" It wasn't unkind, just direct. "Well," she said slowly, "Kyle and I were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend, just family." Nothing big. I glanced toward my laptop sitting open on the kitchen table. My calendar application was still visible on the screen. The weekend was technically open, though I had planned lunch with Dorothy next door and a small book club gathering Saturday evening. Simple plans. The kind people make when they stop arranging their time around everyone else's schedules. "I'm traveling this weekend," I said. "You are?" Lydia sounded genuinely surprised. "Yes." "Where?" "New York." There was a longer silence then. "For business?" she asked. "Yes." Technically, that wasn't entirely accurate. I did have an investor conversation scheduled for the following week and had considered moving it earlier. But the detail hardly mattered. What mattered was the recalibration happening on the other end of the line. Her mother, the one she had quietly categorized as semi-retired and gently fading into quiet hobbies, had business travel. "Oh," Lydia said. It was a small word, but it carried a shift in perspective. "Well, maybe the following weekend then." "I'll check my calendar," I said. We ended the call politely. After hanging up, I returned to my laptop and answered 2 emails from instructors in Colorado who wanted to license one of my advanced quilting modules. The work required attention, and I appreciated that. Numbers and contracts have a way of bringing clarity when emotions start moving around the edges of a situation. Around noon, the second call came. Kyle this time. I was in my office reviewing advertising performance metrics when his name appeared on the screen. I let the phone ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. "Evelyn," he said. His voice had lost some of the dinner table confidence. "Hello, Kyle. I wanted to call personally and apologize for Christmas." I leaned back in my chair. There is a moment during apologies when you can hear the difference between regret and embarrassment. It's subtle, but once you've heard it a few times, it becomes difficult to miss. "That comment about your business was out of line," he continued. "Yes," I said calmly. "It was." Another pause. "I guess we just didn't realize how successful things had become." There it was again. Success, to Kyle, seemed to begin the moment it appeared on television. "I see," I said. His tone shifted slightly. "You know, if you ever wanted help managing the business side of things, investments, taxes, scaling operations, I'd be happy to look things over." I glanced at the framed map on my office wall, showing student enrollment by state. "We have advisors," I said. "Advisors?" "Yes. Accounting, legal, licensing. How long have you had those?" "About 2 years." The line went quiet. 2 years. 2 years during which they had joked about my internet hobby. 2 years during which they had suggested I consider downsizing, because a house this size might become too much. Upkeep. 2 years while I had quietly been building infrastructure. Kyle cleared his throat. "Well, if you ever need a second opinion, I'll keep that in mind." There was a faint edge to his voice now. "Families usually support each other," he said. I looked out the window toward the snow melting slowly along the fence. "They do," I agreed. "And sometimes support means helping each other make smart financial decisions." "That's true." Another pause. Finally, he asked, "So you're saying you don't need help?" "I'm saying we already have it." The conversation ended shortly afterward, not angrily, just neatly. Afterward, I stood from my desk and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. The house felt quiet in that mid-afternoon way when sunlight settles flat across the floorboards and even small sounds seem more noticeable. At the time, I thought the calls might stop there. I underestimated Kyle. Call number 3 came the following morning. But it didn't come from him or Lydia. It came from Chloe. "Grandma Evelyn?" She said in a small, serious voice. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy says rich people don't have time for family." I closed my eyes briefly. Children repeat things with remarkable accuracy. "Rich people still love their families," I said carefully. "Mommy says you might be mad." "I'm not mad." There was a rustling sound on the line. "I heard Mommy whisper that I should call you first," Chloe admitted. That was when something important became clear. They weren't just adjusting their tone, they were adjusting their strategy. And the realization reminded me of something I had learned during the early days of building my platform. People rarely change behavior until their previous approach stops working. "Chloe," I said gently, "can you put your mom on the phone?" "She's in the shower." "Of course she was." I smiled slightly. "Tell your mum she can call me when she's ready to talk directly," I said. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table and looked out toward the backyard. The frost had melted completely by then. The grass looked dull and flattened, the way winter grass always does in January. That was when a memory surfaced. Not about money, about Lydia when she was 12. She had come home from school one afternoon, carrying a science project made from craft sticks and glue. The assignment was simple: build a bridge strong enough to hold 5 pounds. She dropped the materials on the table and said, "This is impossible." I remember handing her the glue bottle. "Try first," I told her. 2 hours later, the bridge held 8 pounds. She looked up at me then and said, "You knew it would work." I told her something I had nearly forgotten until that moment. "I knew you would try." The phone calls this week felt strangely similar, except this time Lydia and Kyle were the ones insisting something couldn't be done. financial discipline, personal accountability, respect that wasn't attached to money. They hoped I would remove the difficulty. Instead, I made a quiet decision. If there was going to be a real conversation about our relationship, it wouldn't happen through grandchildren or holiday dinners. It would happen through something more structured. Procedure. And that was when I began considering legal counsel. I didn't call a lawyer that same day. People sometimes imagine decisions like that happening in dramatic moments. A sudden realization, a burst of anger, a decisive phone call. In reality, most of the important decisions in my life have begun quietly. A thought appears. It lingers. Then it settles into the background, while ordinary life continues around it. In this case, the thought stayed with me for about 2 weeks. January in Maple Grove has a suspended quality to it. The holidays are finished, the ground is frozen, and the daylight arrives late enough that the kitchen still looks grey when I make coffee in the morning. During that time, my business continued moving forward in the ordinary, structured way. Real work does: emails, instructor contracts, licensing, discussions. At 9:10 one morning, I exported the previous quarter's revenue report for my accountant. At 11:40, I forwarded a marketing proposal to my operations manager. At 2:15, I saved a document outlining expansion into advanced weaving courses. 3 small administrative actions: exported, forwarded, saved. After the third one that week, something occurred to me. I had records, not only business records, family ones too, comments, repeated suggestions, jokes that had been framed as harmless observations. A particular Thanksgiving remark from Kyle about how my internet hobby might at least keep me occupied after retirement. None of those things were illegal, of course, but they formed a pattern, and patterns matter. The realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it made me methodical. 2 days later, I scheduled a consultation. Her name was Diane Morales. Her office was in downtown Columbus, about 2 hours from Maple Grove. I chose her after reading several articles she had written about elder financial manipulation and family property disputes. The phrase, elder financial manipulation, had caught my attention. Not because anyone had taken anything from me, because someone had assumed they eventually could. The drive to Columbus was quiet. Snow had been pushed into narrow ridges along the highway shoulders. The sky carried that flat winter color that makes distances appear farther away than they actually are. At the time, I remember thinking Columbus always feels more official than Maple Grove. Taller buildings, glass entrances, people moving quickly between doors with folders tucked under their arms. Diane's office was on the 9th floor of a building that used to house an insurance company. Her receptionist offered coffee. I declined. Some conversations are clearer when your hands aren't holding anything. Diane herself appeared a few minutes later. She was in her early 40s, calm-eyed, the kind of person who listens first and asks questions second. I appreciated that immediately. "So," she said once we sat down, "tell me what made you schedule this meeting." I took a moment before answering. "My daughter and son-in-law believe I'm declining," I said. "Are you?" "No." She smiled slightly. "Then I assume that belief has practical consequences." "Yes," I explained the Christmas dinner, Kyle's comments, the television segment, the phone calls afterward, and one detail that had bothered me more than the rest. 3 separate times during the past year, Kyle had mentioned future property planning. The first time he framed it as concern, the second time as casual financial discussion. The third time, he suggested I might consider moving closer to them so they could keep an eye on things. At the time, I had said very little. Now, sitting in Diane's office, the sequence looked different. She took notes while I spoke. Not emotional notes, just dates and phrases. When I finished, she leaned back slightly in her chair. "Do you currently have a will?" she asked. "Yes." "Power of attorney?" "No." Joint property ownership with your daughter? No. Business ownership structure? Limited liability company. She tapped her pen once against the notebook. Then you're in a strong position. The way she said it cooled something in the room, not tension, just uncertainty. Strong position for what? I asked. For clarity. She turned the notebook around so I could see what she had written. Estate authority, medical authority, financial authority. These are the areas families often try to influence once they believe someone may be vulnerable, she said. The best protection is documentation created before anyone asks for it. That was the moment the conversation shifted from personal frustration to procedure. I felt something settle in my chest. What would that look like? I asked. First, we review your estate structure, she said. Then we designate independent authority holders. Not family? Preferably not. I nodded slowly. At that moment, I realized something I had not fully articulated even to myself. This wasn't about punishing Lydia or Kyle. It was about removing assumptions. Authority doesn't come from being the loudest person in the room. Authority comes from paperwork. Diane drafted the documents over the next week. Nothing dramatic. Just signatures, witnesses, a notary stamp. The paperwork already had my name on it. 2 days later, Kyle called again. I was in my office reviewing student feedback from the advanced quilting course when the phone rang. "Evelyn," he said. His tone sounded different. More urgent. "We need to talk about something." "What's that?" "The house." I paused. "What about it?" "Well," he said slowly, "Lydia and I were thinking, maybe it's time to start planning long-term." Lydia and I. He meant himself. Kyle often used that phrasing when he wanted his ideas to sound collaborative. I let the silence stretch for a moment. "What kind of planning?" I asked. "You know, property, ownership, making sure things are organized before anything happens." There it was, earlier than I expected. "That's already been handled," I said. "What do you mean?" "I reviewed my estate structure last week." Another pause. "You didn't tell us. You didn't ask. So Lydia isn't involved?" "Not directly." His voice sharpened slightly. "That seems unusual." "Not really." "What about access if something happens to you?" "There are procedures." "What procedures?" I glanced toward the folder on my desk. Signed. Filed. Legally binding. "Professional ones," I said. The silence on the line lasted almost 10 seconds. Then Kyle said something that told me exactly where his thinking had been heading. "Well, families usually handle these things together. Some people mistake silence for permission, and some people mistake proximity for authority." I ended the call politely. Afterward, I opened my laptop and reviewed the instructor schedule for the coming week. 3 new courses launching, 2 partnership meetings, 1 licensing agreement with a Texas distributor. Work continued. But something subtle had shifted. The first assumption had broken. And when the first assumption breaks, the rest usually follow. The first real confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in my driveway on a cold Saturday morning in February. I remember the exact sound that woke me: gravel crunching under tires. My bedroom window faces the front of the house, and cars usually slow down before turning into my drive. This one didn't. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 8:14 a.m., too early for visitors. By the time I reached the kitchen window, Kyle's truck was already parked near the garage. That told me 2 things immediately. First, he hadn't called ahead. Second, he expected to be welcomed anyway. I made coffee before opening the door. Procedure first, reaction second. When I stepped onto the porch, Kyle was already halfway up the walkway, hands pushed into the pockets of his jacket. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." He glanced toward the house behind me. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside so he could come in, not because I felt obligated, because refusing him at the door would have turned the conversation into something emotional. Inside the kitchen, the coffee maker finished its cycle with a soft click. Kyle looked around in a way that suggested he was seeing the house differently than before. The walls had always been covered with quilts and framed textile pieces, but now he examined them with the focused curiosity people reserve for things that might have value. "Nice place," he said. "You've been here many times." "Yeah, but I guess I never really looked." That comment carried more truth than he probably intended. I poured 2 cups of coffee and set one across the table from him. He sat down slowly. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence encourages people to reveal their real agenda faster than questions do. Kyle broke first. "I heard you met with a lawyer." The statement arrived directly, without decoration. I took a sip of coffee. "Yes. How did you hear that?" "Lydia mentioned you drove to Columbus." "Interesting." So Lydia had noticed my absence, but hadn't asked about it directly. "What did the lawyer say?" He asked. "That depends on which question you're referring to." Kyle leaned forward. "The estate stuff. There it was again. Estate, ownership, future control." "I organized my documentation," I said. "Without talking to us. I didn't realize I needed permission." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not what I meant." "Then explain what you meant." He exhaled through his nose. "You're our family, yes. And when people get older," I raised a hand gently. "I'm 57. That's not the point." "Then what is?" Kyle shifted in his chair. "The point is, things happen. Accidents, illness, cognitive decline." He didn't say the words, but they hovered between us anyway. "That's true," I said. "So it would make sense for Lydia to have power of attorney, just in case." I watched the steam rise slowly from my coffee cup. This moment had been building for months, maybe years. "You assume Lydia would want that responsibility," I said. "She would. Have you asked her?" Kyle hesitated. "We've talked about it." "We? Lydia and I." I nodded once. "Those conversations happened without me." "Well, yeah. We were just planning ahead." "Planning." I recognized the tone. Calm. Practical. Almost generous. The language people use when they believe their conclusion is already reasonable. "That's thoughtful," I said. Kyle relaxed slightly, thinking the conversation was turning his direction. "But the planning has already been completed," I added. His shoulders stiffened again. "What do you mean completed?" "I've assigned medical and financial authority to professionals." "Professionals?" "Yes." "Not family?" "No." The room grew quiet. Even the refrigerator seemed louder than usual. Kyle stared at the table for several seconds. "That's unusual," he said finally. "Not particularly. But what if something happens suddenly?" "There are procedures." "Which people?" "My attorney and my financial trustee." He leaned back slowly. "So Lydia has no control." Control, that word finally appeared openly. "No," I said. Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. "This feels like you don't trust us." I considered the sentence carefully before answering. "Trust and structure are different things." "How?" "Trust is emotional," I said. "Structure is practical." He didn't seem satisfied with that explanation. "Well, families usually handle these things themselves. That's often where problems begin." Kyle's expression hardened slightly. "So what you think we're trying to take advantage of you?" The question hung there. It was the first time the possibility had been spoken directly. I answered calmly. "I think assumptions were being made." "And now?" "Now the assumptions no longer apply." Kyle stood up and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the snowbanks along the driveway had begun melting in uneven patches. He stayed there for a long moment before speaking again. "You know Lydia's going to feel hurt about this." "That's possible. You could have at least talked to her first." "I tried having conversations," I said quietly. "About what?" "Respect." He turned back toward the table. "That's not fair." Perhaps not, but it's accurate. Kyle ran a hand through his hair. I think you're overreacting. Maybe, but the paperwork is already filed. That sentence ended the argument before it could grow. Because paperwork changes conversations. Once authority has been documented, opinions lose their leverage. Kyle looked toward the hallway where my office sat. "You've changed," he said. I shook my head slightly. "No," I replied. "I've just organized things." He left shortly afterward. Not angry, but unsettled. And that was when I understood something important. The structure I had created wasn't just protecting my future, it was revealing everyone's expectations about it. The next shift came in early March, not through another confrontation, through something much quieter. A bank letter. It arrived in the afternoon mail, plain white envelope, the kind that usually contains statements or routine notices. I remember noticing the return address while standing at the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl. First National Trust, my brokerage account. I opened it with the small letter opener I keep in the drawer near the stove. Inside was a single sheet confirming a routine internal update. My financial advisor had implemented the authority documents Diane had prepared the previous month. Trustee verification complete. Beneficiary instructions confirmed. Third-party authorization activated. It was exactly what I expected. Still, I read the page twice. Not because the information surprised me, but because seeing it printed made the structure feel real, in a way conversation never does. The paperwork already had my name on it. I set the letter beside my laptop and made a small note in my planner. Financial confirmation, March 4. 2 evidence steps. Logged, filed. Then the pressure arrived. The phone rang less than an hour later. Lydia. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded careful again. Not hostile, just cautious. "Hello." There was a soft rustling sound on the line. I imagined her pacing the kitchen in her house the way she used to when she was nervous before school presentations. "Kyle told me he stopped by last weekend." "Yes. He said the conversation didn't go well." "That depends on your definition of well." Another pause. "He said you assigned power of attorney to strangers." I leaned back in my chair. "They're not strangers," I said. "They're professionals. But why not family?" The question came out quickly, almost defensively. "Because professionals follow procedures. Families care about each other. Both statements can be true at the same time." "I'm not sure those things conflict," I said. Lydia exhaled slowly. "You make it sound like we were planning something." "I didn't say that, but that's what it feels like." I watched a patch of sunlight move slowly across the dining room floor. "What it feels like," I said, "is that assumptions were made about my future, and that bothers you." "Yes." The honesty seemed to surprise her. "I thought we were helping," she said quietly. "I believe you thought that, but you don't think we were." I considered the question. "At the time," I said carefully, "I think you were planning for a version of me that doesn't exist." Silence. Longer this time. Then Lydia asked something I hadn't expected. "Do you really think I'd try to control your money?" Control again. That word had begun appearing frequently in our conversations. "I think," I said slowly, "that financial responsibility can create complicated dynamics inside families." "That's not an answer. It's the honest one." Another pause. When Lydia spoke again, her voice sounded softer. "You could have told me sooner." I tried. "When?" "Every time. The business was described as a hobby." She didn't respond immediately. That told me the memory had landed. "I didn't mean that the way it sounded," she said. "I know. But you heard it anyway." "Yes." The conversation drifted after that. Not hostile, just unsettled. We spoke about Chloe's school project, Mason's new soccer team, Lydia's workload at the chemical manufacturing firm where she supervised safety compliance. Ordinary family updates, but the tension beneath them remained. Social lane. Later that week, Dorothy from next door knocked on my door with a container of banana bread. She does this every few weeks. Sometimes she says it's because she baked too much. Sometimes she admits she simply enjoys an excuse to talk. Cold winter, she said, stepping into the kitchen. Almost finished, I replied. We sat at the table while the afternoon light faded through the window. Dorothy has lived in Maple Grove for 42 years. She notices things. Your daughter stopped by the other day, she said casually. Oh? She parked down the street for a while, didn't come in. That detail stayed with me. Did she say anything? No, Dorothy said. But she looked like someone trying to figure out a puzzle. That description felt accurate. People often need time to adjust when their expectations stop working. Dorothy sliced the banana bread and pushed a piece toward me. You know, she said, families get strange around money. Yes, I saw it happen when my brother inherited my father's farm. What happened? Everyone assumed control would shift automatically. And it didn't? She smiled faintly. The paperwork already said otherwise. We sat quietly for a moment. Then she added, the funny thing about documents is that they remove the guessing. That sentence stayed with me after she left. Financial lane. 2 days later, my accountant called about quarterly tax estimates. We spent 30 minutes reviewing revenue projections and expansion plans for the coming year. Enrollment had doubled since the television segment aired. Partnerships were forming faster than expected. At the end of the call, he said something that made me pause. Your daughter and son-in-law must be proud. The statement was kind, but also revealing. I hope eventually they will be, I said. When I hung up, I noticed a message notification blinking on my phone. It was from Lydia, a short text. Mom, Kyle lost his job today. I read the sentence twice. Then I set the phone down without answering immediately, because sometimes the next conversation requires careful timing, and something told me this situation was about to change again. I didn't answer Lydia's message right away, not because I lacked sympathy. Losing a job is rarely simple, especially when it happens without warning. But I had learned something during the past few months. Reacting too quickly often removes the space people need to process their own situation. So I left the message unanswered for about 2 hours. In that time, I finished reviewing a new course outline from one of our instructors in Vermont, responded to a distributor inquiry from Texas, and forwarded a contract revision to my attorney. Ordinary work, structured tasks, the kind that keeps your mind from rushing ahead of the moment. 2 evident steps, forwarded, saved. Then, the pressure arrived. My phone rang. Lydia again. I answered this time. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded tired. I saw your message, I said. There was a pause. Then she spoke quickly, as if she had rehearsed the explanation. The company announced layoffs this morning. Kyle's whole division was cut. They said construction contracts slowed down this winter. That happens sometimes, I said. Yes. Silence filled the space between us. I could hear the faint hum of her refrigerator through the phone line. Are you okay? I asked. I think so. That answer carried more honesty than confidence. Is Kyle home? I asked. Yes. Another pause. He's pretty upset. I could imagine that easily. Kyle had always been someone who equated stability with momentum. When work moved forward, he felt in control. When it stopped suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. What are you going to do? I asked. We're figuring that out. Her voice softened. I guess that's why I texted you. There it was. Not a request yet, just the beginning of one. I stood from my desk and walked into the kitchen, looking out the window at the dull winter grass, still flattened from weeks of snow. At times like this, I said carefully, the first step is usually reviewing the numbers. Our savings? She asked. Yes. We have some. How much? She hesitated. About 5,000. 5,000. Mortgage payments in Maple Grove averaged closer to 2,000 a month. Groceries for a family of four might run 600. Utilities, insurance, car payments. The math arranged itself quickly in my head. That gives you some time, I said. Not much. No. Lydia exhaled slowly. We might need help. The sentence hung in the air. I had expected it. Still, hearing it directly carried weight. What kind of help? I asked. Just temporary support, until Kyle finds something else. I sat down at the kitchen table. Sunlight had shifted across the floor again, forming a long, pale rectangle beside the refrigerator. How long do you expect that to take? I asked. I don't know. Have you started applying for new positions? He's updating his resume. That answer told me something. Updating resumes usually comes before job applications, not during the same week. Let me ask you something, I said. Okay. If I help financially, what changes in your household? She didn't answer immediately. What do you mean? I mean budgeting, spending, planning. Her silence stretched. I guess we just get through the rough patch, she said. That was the answer I expected. And it was also the answer that told me something had to be different this time. I can help, I said. Relief rushed into her voice instantly. Oh, Mom, thank you. But there will be conditions. The relief paused. Conditions? Yes. What kind? Financial ones. There was a long, quiet moment on the phone. What does that mean? She asked slowly. It means we treat this like a recovery plan, not a rescue. She sounded confused. Isn't that the same thing? No. I could hear Kyle's voice faintly in the background asking something from the other room. Can we come over tonight? Lydia asked. That would be better. Okay. We ended the call shortly afterward. I spent the next hour writing notes. Monthly expenses, mortgage estimate, utility averages, debt assumptions, 2 evidence steps, logged, printed. Then I made tea and waited. Around 7 that evening, headlights appeared in the driveway. Kyle's truck again. But this time the engine idled for several minutes before either of them came to the door. I noticed that detail through the kitchen window. People often sit in their cars when they're rehearsing difficult conversations. When they finally stepped inside, both of them looked different than they had at Christmas. Less certain, less performative. Kyle spoke first. I appreciate you seeing us tonight. You're welcome. We sat at the dining table where the Christmas dinner had happened 2 months earlier. Same chairs. Same overhead light. But the atmosphere had shifted. What kind of conditions are we talking about? Kyle asked. I slid the printed pages across the table. Budget outline, expense categories, debt review, savings targets. Kyle scanned the first page. This looks like a financial counseling worksheet. It is. You want us to fill this out? Yes. Before you help? Yes. He leaned back in his chair. That seems unnecessary. I watched him carefully. Why? Because we just need temporary help. And this is temporary structure. Lydia studied the papers more quietly. What happens if we do this? She asked. I'll provide short-term support. How much? Enough to stabilize things while Kyle searches for work. Kyle frowned. And if we don't, then you'll solve the problem another way. The room went quiet again. That's when the room went quiet. I recognized the moment immediately. This was the point where expectations either adjusted or broke. Kyle rubbed his forehead. You're treating us like clients. No, I said calmly. I'm treating this situation seriously. Lydia looked down at the worksheet again. Budget categories, housing, transportation, food, debt, savings. Finally, she said something I hadn't expected. Maybe this isn't a bad idea. Kyle turned toward her. You're serious? Yes. She tapped the paper lightly. We've never actually written our expenses down before. That admission surprised him, but not me. Financial problems often survive because no one writes the numbers down. Kyle stared at the worksheet for several seconds. Then he sighed. Fine, he said. Fine, we'll do it. I nodded once. Good. That night we spent nearly 2 hours reviewing their finances. Mortgage, car loan, credit cards, streaming subscriptions, restaurant spending. When we finished, the situation looked clearer and also more solvable. Kyle leaned back in his chair when we were done. Well, he said quietly, that was uncomfortable. Yes, I said, but useful. He nodded slowly. I noticed something then that hadn't been present in our earlier conversations. Respect. Not dramatic, just emerging. And that's when the real recovery process began. The budgeting meeting changed something in the room that night. Not immediately, but quietly. Numbers have a way of doing that. When they sit on paper in front of you, mortgage payments, grocery costs, car insurance, credit card balances, they stop being vague problems and start becoming measurable ones. Kyle studied the final page of the worksheet for a long time after we finished. I didn't realize it added up like that, he said. Most people don't. It's easier to think in general impressions than exact figures. Lydia traced a finger along the column where we had listed their monthly expenses. We've been spending almost $800 a month on restaurants, she said slowly. Kyle looked surprised. That can't be right. It is, I said. I slid the printed bank statement toward him. 2 evidence steps, printed, reviewed. The pressure arrived. Kyle leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. That's ridiculous. It's common, I said. He stared at the page again. We thought we were doing okay. That's because you were looking at your income, not your spending. The distinction seemed to land. After a few minutes, Lydia asked the question that mattered most. So what happens now? I folded my hands on the table. Now you build a plan. Kyle looked up. A plan for what? For the next 90 days. Why 90? Because most financial recovery happens in the first 3 months. He considered that. And you'll help? Yes. With money? Yes. The word still felt heavy in the room. How much? He asked. 15,000. Both of them looked up quickly. That's a lot, Lydia said. It's a buffer, I replied. For 3 months? Yes. Kyle frowned slightly. But you said there were conditions. There are. He waited. The money stays in your account. That's it? No. Lydia tilted her head. What else? You don't spend it unless your budget plan fails. Kyle blinked. You're giving us money we're not supposed to use? Yes. That doesn't make sense. It does if the goal is discipline. The room went quiet again while they processed that idea. What's the point of having it then? Kyle asked. Security. And that helps how? Because fear makes people make poor decisions. Lydia looked at the worksheet again. So the money just sits there? Yes. And we try to live on what we earn? Yes. Kyle leaned back in his chair. That's different. I smiled slightly. Different often works. He thought about it for a moment longer before nodding slowly. Okay. That answer surprised Lydia. You're agreeing? Yeah, he said. Why? Because if we can fix things without touching the money, he paused. That means we actually fixed them. The logic was simple. And correct. We finalized the plan that night. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, debt reduction. Job search hours. Kyle committed to applying for 5 positions a week. Lydia agreed to reduce discretionary spending immediately. When they left, the envelope containing the $15,000 sat sealed in Lydia's purse. Financial lane. Over the next few weeks, I heard updates regularly. Kyle called to say he had submitted 8 job applications in the first week, then 12 the next. Lydia texted me a photo of their first grocery receipt under the new budget. It was half the size of the previous one. 2 evidence steps. Saved. Filed. But pressure arrived quickly. 3 weeks later, Lydia called again. "Mom, something happened at work." Her voice sounded strained. "What kind of something?" "There was an accident." My stomach tightened slightly. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "But someone else wasn't." She explained the situation carefully. A ventilation malfunction in one of the chemical processing rooms. An employee exposed to fumes. Hospitalization. Safety inspections. At the time, Lydia worked as a compliance supervisor at the facility. Incidents like this meant paperwork. Investigations. Long days. "What does that mean for you?" I asked. "I have to oversee the reporting. And the system that failed is one I flagged for maintenance last year." The sentence landed quietly. "You documented that?" I asked. "Yes." "Good." She exhaled slowly. "The company delayed the repair." "Did they say why?" "Budget scheduling." I made a small note on the pad beside my phone. "Ventilation warning. Delayed repair. Documentation. 2 evidence steps. Logged. Filed." The pressure followed immediately. "If something goes wrong in the investigation," Lydia said, "they might blame my department. That happens sometimes. What should I do?" The question surprised me slightly. 6 months earlier, Lydia would not have asked for advice about professional procedure. "Save every document," I said. "Everything?" "Yes. Emails, reports, maintenance logs." "Okay. And keep copies outside the company system." She paused. "Why?" "Because documentation protects people who follow procedure." Another silence. Then Lydia said something I hadn't heard from her before. "You sound like a lawyer." I smiled. Not quite. But the truth was that the months of organizing my own affairs had changed the way I thought about systems. Structure, authority, evidence. Those concepts were beginning to appear in Lydia's life too. At the time, I didn't know how important that ventilation report would become. But I had a feeling the story wasn't finished yet. The accident at Lydia's workplace happened on a Wednesday. I remember the day because the call came just after noon, right when I was reviewing enrollment data for the spring courses. The numbers had been steady all week, and I had been making notes about expanding one of the advanced modules. Then my phone rang. Lydia. Her voice sounded different this time. Not anxious, not tired, shaken. "Mom," she said, "I think something's wrong with me." I sat up straighter in my chair. "What do you mean?" "I was in the room during the ventilation failure." The words landed slowly. "Were you exposed?" "I don't know." "What symptoms do you have?" "My head hurts," she said quietly. "And I can't focus." That sentence made my chest tighten. "How long ago did the exposure happen?" I asked. "About 2 hours. And you're still at work?" "Yes." "Go to the hospital." There was hesitation on the line. "I can't just leave." "Yes, you can. But the investigation, Lydia. I rarely interrupt people. But sometimes clarity requires it. Your health comes first." A long pause followed. Then she said, "Okay." The line went quiet for a moment before she added something else. "Kyle doesn't know yet. Call him after you hang up with me." "I will." When the call ended, I closed my laptop without finishing the report I had been reviewing. Work could wait. Some situations rearrange priorities immediately. The hospital called later that evening. Not Lydia, a nurse. "Are you Evelyn Carter?" The woman asked. "Yes." "I'm calling because your daughter listed you as an emergency contact." That sentence changed the rhythm of the day, instantly. "What happened?" "She experienced chemical exposure at her workplace." "Is she stable?" "Yes. But we're keeping her overnight for observation." The relief came slowly. Not dramatic. Just the steady release of breath when you realize the situation hasn't become worse than it already is. "Can I speak to her?" I asked. One moment. A few seconds later, Lydia's voice returned, It sounded tired, but clearer. They're doing tests, she said. What kind? Neurological and respiratory. Good. I feel stupid for not leaving the room sooner. People often trust the systems they work inside. I said, that doesn't make them stupid. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something unexpected. I'm glad you made me document everything. The sentence stayed with me. 2 evidence steps. Saved. Filed. Pressure followed quickly. The next morning, Kyle called. She's still in the hospital, he said. Yes. They're running more tests. Did the company send anyone? Her supervisor came by, and they said they're reviewing the situation. That phrase sounded familiar. Corporate language has a predictable rhythm. I made a note on the legal pad beside my phone. Company response, investigation pending. Later that afternoon, Lydia called again. They're releasing me tonight. That's good, but the doctor wants follow-up appointments. For what? Possible neurological effects. My stomach tightened slightly again. Headaches? I asked. Yes. Memory issues? A little. We'll monitor that. There was another pause. Then Lydia asked quietly, Mom, what happens if the company blames me? They might try, I said. Why? Because responsibility is expensive. That answer seemed to settle something for her. I kept the emails, she said. Good. And the maintenance request forms? Good. And the inspection logs? Excellent. For a moment, the conversation sounded less like a worried daughter speaking to her mother and more like 2 people reviewing procedure. Mom, she said after a moment, do you think I should talk to a lawyer? I looked down at the notebook where I had written the company response note earlier. Yes, I said. Do you know one? Yes. Diane Morales had handled my estate structure carefully and calmly. This situation required the same kind of thinking. I'll call her, I said. The appointment happened 3 days later. Lydia and Kyle drove to Columbus while I met them outside Diane's office building. The sky that day carried the dull grey colour of late winter clouds, and the wind between the buildings made the sidewalks feel colder than the temperature suggested. Inside, Diane greeted Lydia with the same calm attention she had shown me weeks earlier. Tell me what happened, she said. Lydia described the ventilation failure, the maintenance request she had filed months earlier, the company's decision to delay repairs. Diane listened without interrupting. When Lydia finished, Diane asked a single question. Do you still have the documentation? Yes. Lydia handed her a folder. Emails, inspection reports, maintenance warnings, 2 evidence steps, reviewed, copied. The pressure arrived quietly. Diane looked up from the papers and said something that changed the entire situation. This is corporate negligence. The words settled into the room slowly. Kyle leaned forward. What does that mean? It means the company knew about the hazard and delayed the repair anyway. And if Lydia suffered medical harm because of that decision, she closed the folder. They may be legally responsible. No one spoke for several seconds. That's when everything changed. Because what had started as a workplace accident was beginning to look like something much larger. When Diane said the words corporate negligence, the room didn't erupt the way people imagine legal moments do. No raised voices, no dramatic reactions. Just a quiet shift in the atmosphere, like the air pressure had changed slightly. Lydia sat very still across from Diane's desk, her hands resting on the folder she had brought. I noticed the way her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the papers, as if she were holding them in place, even though they were already flat. Kyle leaned forward in his chair. You're saying the company knew the system was broken? He asked. Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the folder again and pulled out one of the printed maintenance reports. Let's slow down and look at the sequence, she said. Her tone was calm, almost instructional. The kind of voice people use when they want facts to settle before emotions start moving around them. "This email," she said, tapping the first page, "is Lydia's request for ventilation repair." Lydia nodded. "I sent that last summer." Diane slid the next page beside it. "And this is the internal response." Kyle squinted slightly. "What does that mean?" Lydia leaned forward to read. Her voice sounded quieter when she spoke. "It says repair postponed due to operational scheduling." Operational scheduling. Corporate language tends to soften responsibility. Diane nodded once. "Which means they delayed a safety repair because it was inconvenient." Kyle ran a hand through his hair. "That doesn't sound legal." "It often happens," Diane said. She reached into the folder again and placed another document on the desk. Maintenance log. Inspection date. System efficiency warning. 2 evidence steps. Reviewed. Copied. The pressure followed immediately. Kyle pushed his chair back a few inches. "You're telling me they kept people working in that room knowing the ventilation system wasn't working properly?" "I'm saying the documentation suggests they knew the system required repair," Diane replied. Her phrasing stayed precise. Lawyers tend to choose their words carefully, especially early in a case. Lydia looked down at the papers again. "At the time," she said slowly, "I thought the repair would happen within a week or 2. Diane nodded. "That would have been reasonable. But it didn't. No." The room fell quiet. Outside the office window, downtown Columbus moved in its usual rhythm. Cars stopping at lights, pedestrians crossing the street. Someone carrying a coffee cup past the glass entrance downstairs. Ordinary life continuing, while something more serious took shape, in a small office, 9 floors above the street. "What happens now?" Kyle asked. Diane closed the folder gently. "Now we document everything." She turned a legal pad toward Lydia and began writing. Medical reports, maintenance records, internal communication, incident timeline, 4 lines. Simple, clear. "Every piece of documentation strengthens the case," she said. Lydia watched the list quietly. "And if the company denies responsibility? They might." "What then?" Diane rested the pen against the pad. "Then we present the evidence." Kyle leaned back again, still processing. "And that leads to what, exactly?" "Possibly a settlement." "How big?" Diane gave a small shrug. "That depends on the medical outcome and the strength of the documentation." Lydia shifted in her chair. "I'm not trying to sue anyone," she said. Diane looked at her calmly. "You're trying to protect yourself." The distinction mattered. People often imagine legal action as revenge. In reality, it's often just structure. I spoke for the first time since the conversation had begun. What should Lydia do next? Diane turned slightly toward me. "Continue medical evaluations. And the company? Communicate only in writing." Lydia nodded slowly. "I can do that." Diane wrote another line on the pad. "External copies of all documentation. 2 evidence steps. Saved. Archived." Then the pressure arrived again. Kyle leaned forward suddenly. "What if they fire her?" The question had been waiting quietly in the room. Diane didn't hesitate. That would create a second legal issue. Retaliation. Exactly. Kyle sat back again. The pieces were beginning to align in his mind. "Wow," he said quietly. Lydia looked tired, but there was something else in her expression now. Clarity. The meeting lasted another hour. Medical procedures, reporting guidelines, corporate communication rules. When we finally stood to leave, Lydia looked at Diane with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I never expected my job to turn into something like this," she said. Diane smiled slightly. "Workplace systems usually look stable until something tests them." That sentence stayed with me. Because systems, financial, legal, professional, have a way of revealing themselves when pressure arrives. On the drive home that afternoon, Lydia sat quietly in the passenger seat while Kyle drove. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting across the highway. About 20 minutes into the drive, Lydia spoke. "Mum? Yes? I'm glad you told me to keep the documents." I nodded. "Procedure matters." She looked out the window for a moment. "You've changed a lot in the past year." I thought about that. Maybe she was right. Or maybe the structure had simply made certain things easier to see. "Not really," I said. "I've just organized things." Kyle kept his eyes on the road. For once, he didn't argue. And that was the moment I realized something important. The systems we had put in place, financial plans, legal documentation, structured decisions, were beginning to influence more than one part of our lives. The process wasn't finished yet. In fact, it was only beginning. The settlement discussions didn't begin immediately. Cases like this rarely move quickly at first. There are procedures, medical evaluations, internal investigations, corporate legal reviews. Each step moves carefully, almost deliberately slow. At the time, that pace felt frustrating to Lydia, but Diane had warned us about it. "Large companies move slowly on purpose," she said during one of our follow-up calls. "They're deciding how expensive the truth might become." By late April, the medical reports were clearer. The exposure had caused temporary neurological effects, headaches, concentration problems, fatigue. The doctors believed most symptoms would improve over time, but they couldn't guarantee everything would disappear completely. Those uncertainties mattered, because uncertainty carries financial consequences. One afternoon, Lydia called while I was reviewing a licensing agreement for a distributor in Arizona. "The company's lawyers contacted Diane," she said. "I closed the document on my screen. And? They want mediation." That word signaled the next stage immediately. Mediation meant the company understood the documentation Diane had collected. Maintenance warnings, inspection reports, delayed repair emails, 2 evidence steps, saved, filed. The pressure was building. "What did Diane say?" I asked. "She said we'll listen." That answer sounded exactly like something Diane would say. A week later, we met again in Columbus. Same office building, same conference room. But the atmosphere felt different this time. The corporate attorneys arrived precisely on schedule. 2 of them, both carrying identical black briefcases. Their tone remained professional and polite, the way corporate counsel usually sounds when they're measuring risk. They began with a statement. "First, we want to express concern for Miss Carter's health." Lydia nodded quietly. "We also acknowledge that a ventilation malfunction occurred." Careful language. Acknowledging the event without admitting responsibility. Diane listened without interrupting. Finally, one of the attorneys said what they had come to say. "Our client is prepared to discuss a resolution." Kyle leaned slightly forward in his chair. "What kind of resolution?" The attorney opened a folder. "Financial compensation." Numbers were not mentioned immediately. Corporate negotiations rarely start with the final figure. Instead, they reviewed timelines, medical records, workplace safety protocols. For almost an hour, the conversation moved through documentation Diane had already organized. Inspection logs, maintenance delays, employee exposure reports, 2 evidence steps. Reviewed, copied. Then the pressure arrived. The attorney slid a printed sheet across the table. "This is our initial offer." Kyle picked it up first. His eyebrows lifted slightly. $200,000, he said. The number hung in the room. For many families, that would sound enormous. But Diane didn't react. She simply folded her hands on the table. "That amount does not reflect the documentation we've presented," she said calmly. The attorney nodded politely. "It's an opening discussion." Diane leaned forward slightly. "Let's discuss the medical projections." She slid another set of papers across the table. Projected neurological care, specialist evaluations, Rehabilitation therapy. Lost work capacity. The numbers on those pages were significantly higher. Kyle stared at them quietly. "So what are we actually talking about here?" he asked. Diane answered without hesitation. "Closer to 1 million." The room went quiet. That's when the room went quiet. The corporate attorneys exchanged a brief glance. One of them closed his folder. "We'll need to review that figure with our client." The meeting ended shortly afterward. No agreement yet. Just numbers introduced into the conversation. Outside the building, the wind had picked up again, carrying the last chill of early spring through the streets. Kyle exhaled as we reached the sidewalk. $1 million, he said softly. He sounded less excited than overwhelmed. Lydia looked thoughtful. "It's not about the money," she said. Kyle nodded slowly. "I know. But financial consequences often bring attention to problems companies might otherwise ignore." Over the next month, the negotiations continued. Offers increased. 200,000, 500,000, 900,000. Each time, Diane reviewed the proposal calmly before responding. Procedure, documentation, structure. Meanwhile, Lydia focused on her recovery. The headaches faded gradually. Her concentration improved. But the company's internal investigation continued quietly in the background. One afternoon in early June, Diane called with new information. "I received additional documents from a former employee," she said. "What kind of documents?" I asked. "Previous ventilation complaints." That sentence changed the scale of the case immediately. "How many?" "3. 3 earlier incidents. 3 previous repair warnings. 2 evidence steps. Archived. Reviewed." The pressure returned instantly. "Does the company know about these?" I asked. "They do now." That meant the negotiations were about to change. When patterns appear, liability grows. 2 weeks later, the company requested another mediation meeting. This time, the offer arrived much faster. The attorney slid a new document across the table. Kyle read the number aloud. 1,300,000. Diane remained calm. "Closer," she said, but she didn't accept it. Instead, she referenced the newly discovered maintenance history. 3 previous warnings. Delayed repairs. Internal communications. The corporate attorney closed his eyes briefly. That was the first moment I saw genuine concern on his face. "Give us 48 hours, he said. 2 days later, the final offer arrived. $2,400,000, split between medical coverage, lost income protection, and damages. Kyle stared at the document for several seconds. "That's unbelievable." Diane shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It's accountability." Lydia looked at the page quietly. Then she signed. The settlement finalized in March. The legal paperwork moved quickly after that. Funds transferred, medical trust established, future care guaranteed. But strangely enough, the moment that stayed with me most happened a few days later, when Kyle called me with something I hadn't expected at all. The settlement check arrived on a Tuesday morning. I remember noticing the envelope because it was thicker than ordinary mail. Heavy paper, certified delivery, one of those official-looking packets that tells you something important is inside before you even open it. By then, the legal process had become routine. Documents signed, funds transferred, medical accounts established. Diane called later that afternoon to confirm everything had cleared. "The structure is finalized," she said. "Medical trust, compensation allocation, and long-term care provisions are all in place." "That's good," I said. Her voice softened slightly. "You handled this process very well." I appreciated the compliment, though I wasn't sure it was entirely accurate. Structure had handled most of it. After we ended the call, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking out at the backyard. The early March sunlight had begun melting the last patches of snow along the fence. Water dripped steadily from the gutters. Ordinary sounds, the kind that remind you life keeps moving even after long periods of tension. 3 days later, Kyle called. It was late afternoon, almost the same time Lydia had first called, about the workplace accident months earlier. I noticed the symmetry when the phone rang. "Evelyn," he said when I answered. His voice sounded calmer than it had in a long time. "Yes? There's something I need to tell you." I sat down at the kitchen table. "What is it?" "It's about the $15,000 you gave us last year." I had almost forgotten about that envelope. So much had happened since then that the memory felt distant. "What about it?" I asked. There was a small pause. "We never spent it." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's still sitting in our savings account." The sentence rearranged several assumptions in my mind. "You told me you needed it for expenses," I said. "We did." "Then why didn't you use it?" Kyle exhaled slowly. "Because after that conversation at your house, the one about budgeting, something shifted." I waited. "We decided to pretend the money wasn't there," he continued. That phrasing caught my attention. "What do you mean, pretend?" "We left it in the account as a safety net," he said. "But we tried to solve everything without touching it." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "So how did you cover the mortgage?" "We changed everything." "How?" "We sold the truck," I noticed. "Cancelled the cable package. Practical. Cut restaurant spending completely." I smiled. Faintly. "That alone helps." Kyle laughed quietly. "You weren't wrong about that." There was a moment of silence before he continued. "And Lydia started tracking every expense." "That's good. We also paid off one credit card." "That's very good." He paused again. "You know the strange part." "What?" "Having that 15,000 sitting there made it easier not to panic." I understood that immediately. Security often makes discipline possible. "So the money just stayed there?" I asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the night you gave it to us." "And now?" "Now we want to return it." I shook my head slightly, even though he couldn't see me. "That's not necessary. We want to." "You don't owe me repayment for a gift." "We know," he said. Another pause followed. "But we owe you an explanation." "What kind of explanation?" "What the gift actually did." I waited. "It bought us time," he said. Time. The word carried weight. Time to figure out how to fix our own mistakes. Outside the kitchen window, a neighbor was walking his dog along the sidewalk. The ordinary scene contrasted strangely with the conversation unfolding on the phone. "And the interest," Kyle added. "What interest?" "We added some." I laughed softly. "That wasn't part of the agreement." "Maybe not," he said. "But it feels right." I thought about the entire sequence of events. Christmas dinner, the television segment, the budgeting conversation, the accident, the lawsuit, the settlement, all of it connected by one quiet idea. Some people mistake silence for permission, but some people also mistake help for rescue. "You should keep the money," I said finally. "For what?" "College savings for Chloe and Mason." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes." I heard children's voices in the background, Chloe arguing with Mason about something that sounded like homework. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not fixing everything." The sentence surprised me slightly. "Why?" "Because if you had," he said, "we never would have learned we could." After the call ended, I remained at the kitchen table for a long moment. The settlement had secured Lydia's medical future. My business continued growing quietly in the background. Kyle had begun taking evening classes in construction management. The story had moved in directions none of us predicted. But the real ending hadn't happened yet. It arrived several months later, at another dinner table. The dinner happened almost a year after the Christmas night, when everything began. Same season, different atmosphere. Lydia and Kyle insisted on hosting this time. When I pulled into their driveway that evening, The house looked slightly different than I remembered. The large truck Kyle used to drive was gone. A smaller sedan sat in its place. A new porch light had been installed above the door, and someone had placed a narrow wooden planter beside the steps with rosemary and thyme growing inside. Small changes. But small changes often tell the most honest stories. Chloe opened the door before I could knock. "Grandma Evelyn," she said, throwing her arms around my waist. The house smelled like roasted chicken and garlic. Inside, the living room felt calmer than it had during previous visits. I noticed something immediately: less clutter. Fewer unopened packages. Fewer decorative things that looked like they had been purchased quickly and forgotten. Kyle stood in the kitchen wearing jeans and a plain grey sweater. "Hey," he said. "Hello." There was a brief pause between us, not awkward, just reflective. The kind of quiet that comes after people have spent months learning something about themselves. Dinner was simple: roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans. Chloe insisted on showing me the bracelets she had started selling to classmates. Mason talked enthusiastically about a science project involving magnets and batteries. Lydia moved slowly around the kitchen, still rebuilding her energy but clearly stronger than she had been during the months after the accident. Halfway through dinner, Lydia set down her fork. "Mom," she said. "Yes? There's something I want to say." The room quieted slightly. Even the children paused for a moment, sensing the shift in tone. "I've been thinking a lot about the past year," she continued. Kyle nodded beside her. "We both have," he added. Lydia looked down at her hands briefly before speaking again. "For a long time, we treated you like you were slowing down." The word sounded uncomfortable as soon as she said it. I waited. "Like you needed guidance," she said. Kyle added quietly. "Or supervision." I noticed Chloe watching carefully from across the table. Children are remarkably good at recognizing sincerity. "But looking back now," Lydia continued, "I think we were describing ourselves." That sentence settled into the room slowly. "How do you mean?" I asked. "We were the ones avoiding responsibility," she said. "The ones living past our income," Kyle added. Lydia nodded. "And it was easier to imagine you were fragile than to admit we were disorganized." The honesty in that statement carried more weight than any apology. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. Lydia looked up. "I wish we had realized it sooner." "People rarely do," I replied. Kyle smiled faintly. "You remember that Christmas dinner?" he asked. "I do." "I thought you stayed quiet because you were embarrassed." I shook my head slightly. I was deciding not to argue. He laughed softly. "That turned out to be the most intimidating move you could have made." The table relaxed a little. Later, while clearing dishes, Lydia spoke again. "I started consulting part-time for a workplace safety firm," she said. "I heard. Turns out I have practical experience now." Her voice carried a small trace of dry humor. Kyle rinsed a plate beside her. "And I started my own construction crew," he added. "That's good. 3 employees so far. That's impressive." He shrugged. "It's steady work." But I could hear the quiet pride beneath the words. After dinner, Chloe pulled me into the living room. "Grandma, look," she said, holding up a printed page. It was one of my beginner quilting patterns. "Everyone's moms know your videos now," she said proudly. I smiled. The house felt warm. Not the holiday warmth of decorations and lights. The steadier kind that comes when people stop competing with each other. When I left later that evening, Kyle walked me to the door. Cold air drifted across the porch as we stepped outside. "You know something?" he said. "What?" I used to think support meant solving someone's problems. And now? Now I think support means letting someone face their problems honestly. I nodded. That's closer. As I drove home through Maple Grove, the streets were quiet again. Christmas lights glowed faintly through neighborhood windows. Snow had begun falling again, soft flakes drifting under the street lamps. My business had expanded into 12 countries during the past year. Students from around the world were learning skills that once lived only in small sewing rooms and community workshops. But the most important lesson I learned during that time had nothing to do with business. It had to do with something much quieter. Some people mistake silence for permission. But silence can also be preparation. Preparation to set boundaries. Preparation to change direction. Preparation to become someone other people never expected. And once that structure exists, the rest of life tends to follow it. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Because sometimes the strongest changes in a life don't happen through arguments, they happen through structure. And once that structure is in place, everything else begins to fall into order.